Is China now trying to negotiate peace talks between the regime and the Arakan army, since the AA didn't participate in the last round of talks between the regime and the Three Brotherhood Alliance?
I'm sure the Chinese are talking to everyone and trying to find. China's not interested in peace in any meaningful sense. They're interested in predictability, and they basically was, let's just find an agreement that there's stability, or at least the semblance of stability, and we can all get back to making money, and we can guarantee that our strategic and economic interests are guaranteed. Whatever political arrangement the Arakan army and the Sakasa want to make, I think at least on the face of it, China's not interested. It's your business. It's your, I think that they are actually interested in it because there's potentially billions of dollars at stake. But they've got to be careful how they might interfere in that and what role they're going to take. But the Chinese cannot be unimpressed by the fact that militarily the AA has pulled off something that most insurgent armies have not pulled off in many, many decades. They've basically taken over a large state and territory of two bordering nation states. That's really quite significant, and it's not over yet. I mean, the fact that the AA's taken half of Chin, they're moving into other parts of Chin with their alliances with the Chin Brotherhood, they're moving into Mbogwe, and they're moving into the Irrawaddy Delta. China has to look at that and go, you've done all this in 13 months. We do have to deal with you because you're very strong. You're also, that's what people forget about the AA. It's a national organisation. They're in Chin, they're in Rakhine, they're in the Delta, they're in Mbogwe, they're in Karen State, they're in Northern Shan, they're in Kachin. And they've got lots and lots of friends who are also quite militarily powerful. And any basic Chinese analysts would determine that this is a national organisation that we have to take very, very seriously.
Do you think the international sanctions imposed on the regime throughout the coup have been effective? In your view, which types of sanctions would hit the regime the hardest?
I think the only sanctions that would really hit the regime the hardest would be the kind of sanctions that impede or frustrate its ability to manufacture weapons, to continue to manufacture weapons. Unfortunately, we don't see a lot of sanctions like that. And it's very important to think of sanctions as symbolic in the sense of exposing regime officials and then business people around them, some of whom are actually involved in arms imports and other businesses like that. They are important, but whether they're having the desired effect of toppling the regime or forcing it to negotiate, they're clearly not. And so I think everyone is in a very strange position in which you kind of say to the Americans and to other sanctioning entities, like, keep doing it, but don't expect too much from it. There's some very curious omissions in my view. Why hasn't the United States sanctioned So Chithu of formerly of the Border Guard Force? There's lots of other people that you could actually expose and hopefully make life difficult for them. Some of the banking sanctions that's been called for by Tom Andrews, the UN Special Rapporteur, I think they are actually having an effect. I mean, getting Singapore to kind of basically say, forget this, we're not dealing with you anymore. And just making life frustrating, I think, for various people within the Sakasa system, where they've just got to keep moving their money around. Sanctions are worthwhile just to make life difficult. You're not going to stop them from murdering people, but you're going to make their life difficult, and they've got to kind of move around. I think all of that making it more difficult, including sourcing jet fuel sales and things like that, they're worthwhile just on that measure. But whether they're effective in causing the regime to fall, clearly not. and probably won't. So I think it's important to not overstate the impact of sanctions.
So on the flip side, sanctions have also had a significant impact on ordinary people. Many civilians who are already struggling in so many ways because of the coup now have to bear these additional burdens.
Yeah.
What message would you like to share about how these sanctions are affecting the public?
I think it's morally repugnant to impose measures that punish ordinary people in the hope that they will then rise up and tear down an illegitimate military regime. I just don't think, one, that that's an effective strategy, and two, that it's morally justifiable. And I think any economic measures that do impose further hardships on people inside Myanmar should not exist. The idea that you should just completely close the entire country off, make everyone suffer, and then they'll storm Naypyidaw and kill Min Aung Hlaing. That's absolutely absurd. And the level of suffering inside Myanmar now, caused by economic hardships, lack of electricity, lack of employment, is not sustainable in the long run. And again, I think anyone on the outside of the country that says punish everyone in order to get regime change, that is just indefensible. And the people of Myanmar don't deserve that at all. No one does. So yeah, if that is in any way a calculation on the part of people formulating sanctions, and I do think that a lot of the countries formulating sanctions, the people doing it, are trying to minimise the suffering as much as possible. I think it's more activists and certain kind of exiled voices having this argument. I don't think it's necessarily people designing the sanctions, who I do think are trying to not have that effect. They're actually trying to impact the Sarkisar and the senior generals, not ordinary people. Yeah.
The Blood Money campaign launched its report Close the Sky on January 9th.
Yeah.
It calls for a global aviation fuel ban on Myanmar. This campaign has already gained momentum over the last year. Do you think it will lead to international action?
I certainly think it's not going to hurt. I do think it's a good campaign and a campaign worth having. But again, similar to other sanctions, you've got to be very honest about what impact it's going to have. There's been attempts to ban jet fuel for a few years now. And yet, as Amnesty International and other research has shown, the Sarkisar is still managing to get fuel supplies. And in fact, it's a sad reality that as the jet fuel campaign was really kicking off, airstrikes in Myanmar actually tripled in 2024. And that's you've got to actually have that realization. It's like, look, it's a very good campaign. You should be doing it. It's potentially one weakness on the part of the military. It's definitely worth having. Unfortunately, it's just not working now. You've got to make that assumption. There's been more daily sorties and bombings and murder. Look at any of the figures, and it just dramatically goes up in most of 2024. But that said, again, this is something that needs to be talked about. And I think the strength of that campaign is that it's trying to raise global awareness. It's trying to get more people interested in this and trying to have more of a conversation about what measures can we impose that actually will have more of an effect. And that's where I think the strength of that campaign really is, about trying to raise more international awareness.
Doesn't this mean if the regime loses access to aviation fuel on the international market, then China, Russia, and other countries friendly with Naypyidaw will deliver more, just like they do with weapons?
Potentially, yes. One of the challenges there, I think, is that they won't be able to get jet fuel from Bangladesh because the Arakan Army controls the borders now. They probably be very difficult to try and get it from China because the Three Brotherhood Alliance and their allies control most of the roads. leading in there. The same with Thailand. They can still put fuel trucks across the border, but they don't fully control all of the roads from the border to... what they do control is the port of Yangon. And until the resistance can interdict that, then I think that there will continue to be jet fuel that comes into the country. That's the one piece of the puzzle that I think people should be looking at, is as long as the military can control the port and the entrance to the port up the Yangon River, and then control the roads and railway and waterways to Magwe and all of the Kapasa, the defence factories, and then being able to supply all of the network of military air bases from Miktila down to Taungu and others, then they can still just hold on. They won't be able to win the war just with airstrikes. That's impossible. But they could clutch to the centre for quite some time. And the ethnic armed organisations know this very, very well. And I'm sure the next stages of their strategy, which they're keeping very, very quiet, to their credit, is also factoring all of this in. So yeah, I think it's important to target jet fuel, but in and of itself, it's not a winning strategy. A winning strategy needs to have multiple parts to it in order to succeed.
The NUG acting president, Dua Lashila, repeated calls for all ministers to return to Myanmar. Would this move help the NUG gain more international support and legitimacy over the regime?
No. I don't think it will have any practical effect on the international stage at all. I don't think the National Unity Government, writ large, I don't think it's made that much of an impact around the world, regardless of what many of its supporters might think. Now, part of that is that the NUG simply hasn't mounted a very credible international foreign policy strategy. They've been quite unimpressive, I would have to say. But also look at the environment that they're competing in. First it was Afghanistan in 2021, then it was the Ukraine, and then since 2023 it's been Gaza, and then the US presidential elections and lots of other news. Plus there's absolutely horrific crises in Sudan, and there was in Ethiopia before that. And so Myanmar's competing for a lot of international attention slippage, you can say. And what the NUG hasn't done very effectively is make Myanmar a more compelling case. And I think it's been very misguided in trying to grab the credentials from the United Nations and to try and claim a legitimacy that it simply doesn't have. In that way, it's been very uninspiringly conventional and not revolutionary. And unfortunately, a lot of countries, especially in the West, but also most importantly in Asia, look at the NUG and think, you simply, it's not going to work. And also, you haven't shown any propensity for reform. We haven't seen you reaching out to regional countries in more effective ways. And I think there's a sense, starting with China, but also I think permeates around the region, that the NUG immediately went running off to the West to try and get support. It went running to America and Europe. And I think in Asia it's kind of like, oh, that's pathetic. Why didn't you come to us first? And I don't think the NUG's really gotten over that it's really seen as a Western liberal construct. And the unfortunate element with that is that the West doesn't really care about the NUG, regardless of what they might say. And so, yeah, I would have to say that the NUG's foreign policy has been an absolute dismal failure, and it's been compounded by the fact that they're continuing along the same path. And what they've done is also let down their allies in the ethnic armed organisations and ethnic communities, and they've let down the people of central Myanmar in this, and that's what they have to face up to. That their international strategy is just not worked.
How can the international community meaningfully support the resistance and uprising to the 2021 coup?
I think on the one hand, you've got to say that the international community, mostly Western donors, have been good in providing humanitarian assistance. They could certainly have delivered a lot of that humanitarian assistance more effectively, but there are a lot of good things that have happened since the coup. But the needs are dramatically rising. Nearly 20 million people in the country need some form of humanitarian assistance. The challenges are that a lot of the systems, especially the United Nations, are just woefully ill-suited for the task. And unfortunately, a lot of Western donors do put their money through the United Nations. And the United Nations are very conventional. They like governments. They don't like revolutionary situations. And they like plain sailing. They don't like difficulty. And that's a problem. A lot of the international humanitarian NGOs, they're just like the United Nations. They don't necessarily care. They just want to keep things moving and keep getting paid. And where I think that the West has abjectly failed and worked almost actively against the revolution is in some of its support for civil society and especially the Myanmar media. A lot of the Western donors, in my view, are criminally negligent in privileging certain international organisations and paying foreigners to advise the NUG and the NUCC, at the same time stripping funding from the Myanmar media and from civil society. And to me, that is a frankly racist approach. They're basically saying that a handful, a clutch of overpaid white men are more important than hundreds of Myanmar reporters is, to me, neocolonialism. And it is actively working against the revolution in the sense that a lot of these Western donors are taking public information and turning it into private information in their own little think tanks and how they talk about things, and are actively endangering the ability of the Myanmar public to know what's going on. And that's the duty of the Myanmar media, not the international media, who are mostly pretty absent. But the fact that Western donors are trying to kill the Myanmar media is, to me, a grave crime against the country, and should be reversed. The problem is a lot of, especially Western donors, are getting frustrated with where they see the conflict going and don't want to face up to the idea that there is a new Myanmar appearing. They see it as fragmentation or disorder, as anarchy. What they don't see is the beginnings of new societies. And there are some Western donors who are actually quietly trying to support the emerging bottom-up federalism, and they should be commended. But all of those good things that are being done by some Western donors, and by the way, I think, talking about elections this year, you are going to see quite a few international organisations that are going to be subtly playing along with some of these elections because they see that there's money to be made. And so I think anyone working on the elections should keep an eye over their shoulder about what some Western organisations will be doing around the elections. And there'll be some fairly sinister moves, I think, going on. But writ large, we just have to conclude that the West has pretty much abandoned Myanmar, by and large. That's partly because it's just too frustrating, and partly because a lot of people did not want to recommit after 10 years of really helping Myanmar quite a lot. The way that the West is kind of walking away from it is really quite... I think that there will be long-term ramifications in the way that the country then views the West, democracy, liberalism, and transparency in the future. I don't think the West fully understands the damage that it's doing to its relationship with the people of Myanmar.
Yeah. Looking ahead this year, what do you think the resistance will achieve? Will it make significant progress in the collapse of Main Aung Hlaing's regime?
I think the momentum will almost certainly continue. The challenge is that it's just impossible to predict anything in Myanmar, and that's been the way certainly since the coup, but I would say even before that. I think given the momentum of the past year and a half since Operation 1027 and the undoubted territorial gains by so many different armed groups, the challenge is going to be consolidating those gains. It's one thing to militarily take over territory. It's another thing to get cities and towns up and running again, especially when you're being bombed from the air. In some cases, places like Lasho seem to, through a synthesis of the MNDAA and some CDM administrators and others, and cooperation from the people within the city, there appears to be some good things kind of happening. And I hear similar things from Mogok. But all of these challenges, I think, are really going to be immense. And the fundamental challenge will be, how do you pay for it all? And so a lot of the EAOs are going to need to generate funds in order to get electricity back on, get kids back in school, and get the healthcare system going, and to repair all the damage that the Sakasa bombing and the fighting has done. So I think that's going to be, a major kind of rearguard challenge. But then to militarily sustain the pressure on the Sakasa. And I think in 2025 we're going to see, I think, potentially more of the immense challenges of trying to fight in the centre of the country in a more consolidated way, and to start surrounding the cities and the main arterial roads. That's the only relatively safe assumption, certainly not a prediction, but an assumption that we'll see in the coming year. But that said, it's such a dynamic, uncertain environment that you just never know what political strategies some of the EAOs, the idea of a tactical ceasefire. We've seen the AA do that in the past. We've seen different EAOs do that in the past. It's like, okay, ceasefire, great. We'll take a year and a half off while we're getting ready for the next phase. And, it's certainly not part of a peace process. But I do think that the wild card will be the elections and how various armed groups respond. And I think already we should be seeing from the National Unity Government and from others a call for everyone in the country, leave these elections alone. They're stupid, they're utterly illegitimate, no one's going to take them seriously. The NUG has that fantastic committee called the Anti-Sham Elections Committee, which I think is a great name. And that should be the message. Don't kill anyone. Keep violence out of these stupid elections, because that will seriously impact the way that the world sees the revolution. They're utterly meaningless elections, so just let them run their stupid course. But I think what's playing out behind the scenes with all of these, from ASEAN to all of these really sinister Western secret mediation efforts, they're not going anywhere. And I think that they're sadly kind of misleading a lot of people. There's some kind of sense that something's being done behind the scenes, but they're clearly not. All of the people involved in these secret negotiations are just fooling everyone.
So before we conclude, is there anything you'd like to add or highlight that we might have missed?
I think that the one thing that I would emphasise is that, by all accounts, the suffering throughout the country is just reaching epidemic proportions. And I do think that injecting more humanity and concern for average people into the way that we cover the news, the way that we talk about conflict, is really necessary. That I think I hear from people inside that they do not want a peace that keeps the military still in power. They want to see the fall of Min Aung Hlaing. They hate the Sittap. I hear that from lots of different people. But that said, they are suffering quite a lot. And I do think it's incumbent upon all of us in the outside to perhaps measure what we say and how we talk about victory and how we talk about the justness of the cause with a sense of how people inside are actually suffering. There's 1 million people displaced just in Karen State. I mean, that's That's insane. There's nearly 1.5 million in Sagaing. There's been more than 100,000 houses burnt down. The vast majority of them in Sagaing. And so I do think we need to keep in mind the humanitarian imperative when we talk about Myanmar, and not dismiss suffering as somehow a process towards victory.
Yeah. Thanks for your time and thoughtful discussion.
Thank you very much.
I appreciate your critic.
Thank you very much.